Well, if you've been journeying with us over the last 5 weeks, we've been in this cracking series about God's love. It's all been about what is God like? What is his love like? And we've talked about how his love is eternal and it never runs out. We've talked about how you can experience it. It's not just something you can know, but it's beyond that. It's something that goes deep into your heart. And not only that, it's a love that can change you, And so we're starting this new series now, which is all about what happens next once you've received that love. So if you like, if love is the frame, if that's the thing that we've got in our hearts, then what happens now? How do we walk out in that love? And we've called it, this new series, How to Really Live. I'm really excited. I think there's so much in it that's really helpful. But today we're starting off also into Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. And you can sort of picture the scene, can't you? Jesus must be, bless him, quite tired, presumably. And he's gone away from the crowds and he's gone up into the mountainside. And he sat down. And his disciples have come to him, his followers. And this isn't just the 12, this is beyond that. This would have been a larger group. And most theologians believe that as Jesus starts to speak to the crowds, more and more people turn up. More and more people come and listen to him. And it's interesting that he chooses to go to the mountains to speak this. Many thousands of years, probably about 2,000 years before, Moses also goes up into a mountain and gets the 10 Commandments. And then here we have the one that Moses was pointing to, Jesus, going up into what most people seem to be calling, or lots of theologians call, God's pulpit, which I love, the mountain. And he starts to speak. He sits, as the rabbis sit, and he starts to say things that no one has said before. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are those who are merciful. And not just that, those who really show mercy to others because they will then receive it. Jesus is saying truth after truth after truth. And each time he says a truth, he's not saying, if you follow this, you're in. If you follow these little actions, then you get into my kingdom. No, he's saying this is what it looks like to have the kingdom of God in your heart. This is the example of what will come out of you if you know your Father in heaven and if you follow me. One person described the Beatitudes as what we should be like. Beatitudes. The word kind of means, and this does not sound very cheerful, distinctive religious joy. Can you imagine if you arrived at a party and said, I've got lots of distinctive religious joy? I think I'd be like, get out. But the actual word, makarios, is so much deeper than that phrase sums up. It means to have a joy in you that goes way beyond any circumstance you or I will ever face. And it's sort of... It's to have a deep satisfaction. It's rooted and grounded in knowing God. And you can't help but it pouring out of you. And so Jesus goes through all these different Beatitudes. And then finally he gets to verse 8. It's not the last Beatitude, but it's the one I just got a sense that we should focus on tonight. Verse 8. If you have a Bible, it's page 968. Be worth having a look at. Jesus says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. I was thinking of the word pure. It's not really a word that's particularly fashionable in our society. I was thinking on social media, if someone was described as pure, you might think, yeah, they're quite a naive person perhaps. They haven't really lived yet. They will experience things, but they haven't yet. That's often how people seem to refer to people who are described as pure. But actually, that's not what Jesus is getting at when he says, blessed are the pure in heart. A better description is, there's a Danish philosopher. He was very popular when I was at college, and his name is fun to say, Kierkegaard. If you're ever bored, just practice that at home. Kierkegaard. And He's a philosopher that described, I think, the best definition of pure in heart that I've come across. He said this: purity of heart is to will one thing. It's one thing. The pointing of all our desire, all our love to God alone. That's purity of heart. It's interesting that David said in Psalm 27, one thing I ask, this only will I seek. Or Jesus said, seek first the kingdom of God. It's the one thing. I had a slightly interesting experience on Friday. I went into, this is incredibly Chiswick, so apologies about this. I went into the Source bulk food shop on Turnham Green Avenue. Has anyone ever been there? And you go in there and they have lots of refills of things. You can buy olives and that sort of stuff. And most people go in for slightly more sophisticated things. I go in for the hot chocolate. Anyway, so I arrived on Friday, went in, and they have all these jars along the side, jars like this. And I said to the lady, where's the hot chocolate in the jar? And she looked at all the different jars and she said, no, we've run out, sir. There are no more jars. And she said, if you want hot chocolate, you have to find it in its purest form. You have to go and get the cocoa from over there in that jar. And then you said you have to go and get the sugar in that jar. And I was thinking, I just want hot chocolate. But that's the definition of purity that's in the Bible. It's one thing. It's one ingredient. It's our heart's desire, single-minded devotion to God. And it's interesting because the purity of heart is utterly different to what the religious leaders were talking about at that time. There was a real culture with the Pharisees where they would have these rules. And to be fair to them, I think a lot of these rules, if we're being charitable, were sort of to help the people not go wrong, to make sure they're right with God. But they would have all these different rules of things that you had to do. And it was, if you like, self-effort to create your righteousness. You had to obey this, do that. And the Pharisee said, if you do all these things, then eventually you'll be right with God. And then Jesus comes along and he turns that upside down. And he says, it's about the heart. It's about devotion to God. And I think perhaps the best description, or the one that really struck me this week as I was reflecting on what does it mean to be pure in heart, is actually the little story of Mary and Martha. If you have a Bible, I'd encourage you to turn to it. It's just in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42. I'll say that again. Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42. It's on page 1042. Page 1042. It's probably a story you know really well, but I think it's a really good description of this single-minded devotion. So I'm sure you know the story. Jesus is traveling with his friends, and he's arriving into the town of Bethany. And as they arrive, they have been invited into the home of this lady called Martha. And it actually says Martha opened her home to him. And so Jesus arrives at the door and he kind of knocks, and then Martha and her sister Mary invite Jesus to come in. And of course they come in, and Mary sits at Jesus' feet and she just starts to listen. And can you imagine being in that room, listening to Jesus talk, listening to him share his heart? It would be beautiful. I don't know if you've ever had sort of time with someone who's particularly wise and you just listen to them speak and you drink it in, and it's like it feeds you. I wonder if you've ever had that before. And I think that's the sense we get here of Mary sitting and just listening. But poor Martha, verse 40, it says she was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She's working, she's cleaning, she's preparing. And I think if we're, again, being a bit charitable to Martha, probably she's going, do you know what, these are the things I need to do to make sure that this meeting goes all right. In some ways, it's easy to feel quite sorry for Martha. She's working really hard. And yet, when she sees that her sister is just sitting and looking up at Jesus, she starts to get cross. And so she comes over and she says, Lord, don't you care? Don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. And it's interesting, Jesus' response. And I said this morning when we looked at this verse, I said, if someone says your name twice, you kind of know you're in trouble, right? And she said, and Jesus says, Martha, Martha. You can imagine Martha going, oh no. And Jesus says, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, or some passages describe it as the better portion, and it will not be taken away from her. And tonight, the encouragement I want to give you, and I'm going to put it on the screen, is this. When it comes to this, Mary turned from the distractions that she had, and she gave single-minded devotion to God. It's interesting that for many of us, we are so busy in our modern day culture. And it can be so hard, can't it, to put aside what are probably quite good things so that we can focus on the best, which is to worship God. For Mary, she turned from her distractions and she focused on God. You know, in the Bible it says the enemy is a prowling lion. It's like he's trying to devour people, seeking people to kill and destroy. And it's interesting, I think one of the tactics that the enemy sometimes uses is he just distracts us from God. If you've ever read the Screwtape Letters, it's an interesting book by C.S. Lewis, the writer. And it's all about how it's sort of a parody, really, playing on and imagining how devils would write to each other, helping each other to distract Christians from the faith. Anyway, there's one little moment in the Screwtape Letters where one devil writes to another and says, don't try and distract the man that you're trying to tempt away from God. Don't try to do sort of logical arguments. Don't try and make a really good theoretical thing that he can believe so he can go away from God. Make him remember that he's hungry. Send him off to go and have lunch, and then maybe he'll be distracted. And actually, as I was reading that, I was reading it a few years ago with some friends, I realized actually that's one of the tactics of the enemy, is that he wants to distract us from that single-minded devotion. And we can actually spend our time focusing on things that God didn't quite ask us to do. They're not wrong things, it's just that they're not what God asked. The Apostle Paul says, if anyone builds on the foundation of, and then he talks about wood, hay, and straw, he says it will be burned up. What are you building on? What are you dwelling in? Who are you spending your time trying to become like? What are you drinking in? Are we people who will get distracted, or are we unapologetically going after single-minded devotion to our God? So it's an encouragement. Perhaps we can think tonight about our devotions and our distractions. Number 2. It's interesting that one got worried and one had a single-minded devotion. And I suggest to you that it was rooted in trust. And what I mean by that is this. If you think about the kind of anxieties that people could have in that culture, I mean, who knows? Perhaps Mary would have had money problems. Maybe she had health issues. We don't know. I'm sure there'd have been things in her life that weren't great, just as we know that Martha was getting anxious about things that were happening. And yet what's interesting is that Mary seemed to be able to push those to one side and worship. And it's interesting, I think that takes a level of trust to say, God, I know that I've got this and this and this that are weighing me down, but I'm going to choose to put them to one side and I'm going to trust you. Someone once described it as a holy naivety. And yet it's not naive, is it, to put our worries and our concerns on Jesus, for he cares for us. How did Jesus sort of model this trust? Well, he would go off on his own to pray. We know he went up a mountain to pray. He went in a garden to pray. He went by a lake. He went in the wilderness. And do you know what? He spent time with his Father. He prepared himself. And there's the same thing that Mary did. She pushed aside her anxieties. She pushed aside distractions. And she trusted. Number 3, Mary's, and this is the last one, Mary's motives are a really interesting thing when it comes to faith. Mary's motive was Jesus' glory. All she wanted in that time was nothing for herself. She wanted to drink in and to worship her Lord. She sat, she listened, she learned. And it's interesting that when Martha became so angry and frustrated, what did she do? She came to Jesus and said, look, it's not fair. It's not fair. And it's interesting. Often our motives for when we serve or when we worship, sometimes they can be a bit mixed. I think mine are a bit mixed. And I went to see a wise friend recently, a bit of a mentor, and he said to me that because his motives are mixed, and this guy's been a Christian for many years, and I think a really godly man, he said to me, because my motives are mixed, he says, I pray every day, Lord, would you help with my motives? Would you help me, even though they're mixed, to still love you and to make it about you? It's single devotion to God. It's saying, Lord, I want to glorify you. And what's the result of doing this? Well, Jesus said, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Do you want to see God tonight? Do you want to grow in that intimacy with him? Do you want him to lead you? And then when you're struggling, do you want him to be so close to you? Or do what Mary did. We're encouraged to come and kneel and devote ourselves to him. And it's interesting, Mary was kneeling before the one person who would go on to deal with all the problems and all the pain in all the world, who would die on a cross, and then who would rise again and defeat every issue. And it's not that we won't face problems in this life, but that we will have our sin dealt with on the cross and we will be able to come home. And that's the offer we have. It's an invitation to single-hearted devotion. And it's an offer that we all have and we can take up every day. Let's pray together, and I'm going to pass to Aaron.